Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for joining. It is a true honor to present our next speaker, Reinhold Martin. Reinhold Martin is a professor of architecture from Columbia University in New York, USA. He's a historian of architecture, technology, and media, professor of architecture in the Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation at Columbia University, and chair of Columbia's Committee on Global Thought. His current work extends the study of knowledge infrastructures into two areas: the political economy of technology and philosophical aesthetics. Martin's books include Knowledge Worlds, Media, Materiality, and the Making of the Modern University from 2021, The Urban Apparatus, Media, Politics, and the City, 2016, Utopia's Ghost, Architecture and Postmodernism, again, 2010, and The Organizational Complex, Architecture, Media, and Corporate Space, 2003. Previously, he has directed the Templehoin Buell Center for the Study of American Architecture and chaired the Society of Fellows Heyman Center for the Humanities at Columbia, and was a founding co-editor of the journal Grey Room. So Reinhold, please welcome. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you, Ingrid, so much, and for the invitation, and also to all who have organized this rather complex event, hybrid as it is. I will try to make this talk as available to conversation as possible. And so with that in mind, I'm going to speak for probably about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for Q&A. And just to begin, I want to say that in the brief for the conference, the organizers list 4 questions, which I presume in one way or another you've already been discussing, and I regret and apologize for my absence in person, so it would be nice to hear what people are saying. But in any case, the first question from the brief concerns the influence of what has been known since the mid-1950s as artificial intelligence, or AI, on daily life as well as in society at large, including politics. The second concerns the implications for gender identification, and I assume we could extend that to subjectivity in general. The third question concerns AI and environment, and the fourth, the implications and possibilities for architecture. So I'm afraid I will not be able to answer in any definitive sense any of these questions, nor would I expect them to be answered elsewhere in this or any other such conferences. These are obviously very large and substantial concerns. Instead, I will take them together. So really what I'm going to try to do, take these together as a prompt to consider what they tell us, what the fact that we're asking these questions tell us about the society in which these questions have arisen. In other words, I begin by asking, for what kind of society are such questions concerning artificial intelligence meaningful in the first place? So I will, to keep you occupied visually so you don't have to look at me, I'm going to share my screen. So this image is basically what I'm talking about the whole time. You'll see, I hope. As it happens, the expression for which AI serves as an acronym entered popular usage at an 8-week research seminar or workshop held at Dartmouth College in New Hampshire in 1956, entitled the Dartmouth Summer Research Project on Artificial Intelligence. Organized principally by the young mathematician John McCarthy, the summer seminar, this is not Dartmouth, this image, it'll make sense later. The summer seminar is remembered for many things, not least for the debut of the so-called logic theorist computer program that was written by Alan Newell, Herbert Simon, and with Cliff Shaw, on which I have a little bit more to say in a moment. But first, for our purposes, McCarthy's decision to name the project as he did, artificial intelligence, has two important consequences. One that introduced clarity, and the other a little bit of confusion. Apparently, McCarthy chose the term artificial intelligence for the grant proposal to the Rockefeller Foundation seeking support for the conference. This is the kind of origin story for the concept. And he chose this to avoid comparison and competition with Norbert Wiener's cybernetics, the term cybernetics. And indeed, this difference does matter. More ambiguously, however, the A in AI, which designates something artificial about the intelligence in question, encourages comparison to an intelligence in one way or the other more natural. Not, however, because of the evident artificiality of thinking machines, but because of the potential artificiality of thinking humans. So that's, in a sense, the through line that we're going to try to follow through this talk. As the historian of science Paul Edwards has emphasized, the concept of intelligence discussed that summer, this is 1956, at Dartmouth, did differ significantly from the and neural network-based cybernetic model of computers as embodied electronic brains. That's the cybernetic version. At Dartmouth, as in early AI discourse more generally, and although the computer as brain paradigm persisted, what came to the fore instead was an understanding of computers as modeling disembodied mathematical minds, or processors of abstract symbols. This conceptual difference between what Edwards calls the computer brain and the computer mind, two essentially different paradigms, had a significant impact on the path followed by AI research in subsequent decades and remains with us still today. Now, a key feature of Newell's and Simon's logic theorist program was that beyond mere calculation, it manipulated and appeared to understand symbolic logic. With the basic rules of logic programmed into memory and expressed symbolically, and limited by heuristic protocols or rules of thumb designed to avoid blind alleys, the program followed what they called search trees that proceeded from the root hypothesis or proposition to its proof. So it was able to demonstrate a logical proof. Successfully proving 38 of the first 52 theorems in Bertrand Russell and Alfred North Whitehead's Principia Mathematica in this manner, so basically this program proved the theorems, logic theorist, which some consider the first true AI program, was said by its co-author Newell to have solved the ancient mind-body problem by showing, quote, how a system composed of matter, that is, computer hardware, stuff like this on the screen, can have the properties of mind, that is, symbolic reasoning. Now, grandiose as this claim may have been, it does, in a sense, put a finger on the pulse of our concerns today by suggesting that, in effect, mind was brain or body independent, and could be reproduced in a purely mechanical system through operations of formal logic expressed symbolically. So that's the point, is it really doesn't matter from this point of view what the hardware is. It's that symbolically mind is manifest. But the question is, was this intelligence? In 1950, the mathematician Alan Turing had already prepared the ground. So that's 6 years prior. In 1950, Alan Turing had already prepared the ground for such a question with his famous paper, Computing Machinery and Intelligence, published appropriately enough in the philosophical journal Mind, which is generally considered another founding document in the AI canon. The paper specified what has become known as the Turing test, and Turing worked on the machine I'm showing you, the Manchester Mark I computer, which was inaugurated in 1949, just before he wrote the paper. And he mentions this several times in the paper. The paper specified what has become known as the Turing test, which replaces the question, can machines think, with what Turing calls an imitation game that proposes an answer to answer a more modest, or at least a seemingly more modest question, that in fact goes unformulated in this way in the paper itself. Basically, what I think we can say is that Turing is asking the question, can machines imitate thought? But before going on to consider this question, and in the process to address the relation of AI to gender and to subjectivity more generally that our organizers of the conference have posed, I need to digress briefly with a couple of stories. The first is a classical fable, and followed by two philosophical allegories that I think help us understand. So we're going to become a little more abstract now, if you'll have to bear with me. Two philosophical allegories that I think help us understand the Turing test itself as a third allegory in which the 20th century, in effect, dreams the 21st. So first is the fable. Perhaps you know this story. It's the story from Pliny the Elder of another kind of imitation game, a competition between two famous painters, Zeuxis of Heraclea and Parrhasius of Ephesus, both of whom were renowned for their feats of painterly mimesis, or the imitation of nature. Zeuxis, the story goes, began the competition, it's a kind of competition between two painters. He began the competition by painting an image of grapes that was so realistic that the birds in the air mistook these grapes for the real thing and began pecking at the painted panel. They tried to eat the painting. Surely, with this deceit, Zeuxis had won. He must have won the contest, for there could be no mimetic feat greater than fooling nature itself, fooling the birds. Full of bravado, he approached the entry of his rival Parrhasius and demanded that the curtain be lifted from the painting so that he could view the image underneath. Informed by Parrhasius that the curtain was the painting, in other words, Parrhasius had painted a curtain-covered panel, Zeuxis had no choice but to concede defeat. His rival had deceived the painter, who had himself only deceived nature. So this tendency to deceive by imitation has, however, placed the arts at a comparative disadvantage with respect to the sciences, and this is really since classical times. It is why, for example, Plato mistrusted poets and demanded that they be banished from his ideal republic. It is therefore surprising to find the classical aesthetic problem of mimesis, imitation, at the heart of Turing's foundational computer science paper. For what could be more insubstantial, that is, more unreal, than a mere imitation, especially when it comes to the presence of something like a mind, or at least intelligence? But that's the point. The intellectual tradition to which the computer minds of AI belong, and most of the discourse around AI really is in this lineage of the computer mind as distinct from the computer brains, is a distinctly idealist one. This is a distinctly idealist tradition. That is a tradition also quite distinct from the materialist one that would cause us to dwell on the hardly artificial stuff, like the room that I'm showing you here, from which these minds and machines were and are made. To be sure, an idealist notion of intelligence grounded in the logical manipulation of symbols is today more neo-Kantian than Neoplatonic in character. Still, to measure the difference from those materialist concerns, which are typically the ones that govern discussions in the history of technology and indeed in architectural history, to measure the difference from these materialists related to real social relations and to real things like, for example, buildings, that underlie the questions posed by our conference organizers, I suggest returning to Western idealism's primal scene, Plato's allegory of the cave. So here's the first allegory that goes with this fable. So there in Plato, we find what we can call a media complex. This, again, you may recall, is a kind of mise en scène of an underground enclosure with a steeply inclined entrance, a cave, then a fire, a low screen, puppets, and a group of humans in fetters, chained to the cave, their backs to the distant sun that's showing through the opening of the cave, and therefore unable to access this brightly lit realm of what Plato calls ideas above, in which the phenomena that they perceive before them on the screen, basically they're watching a kind of shadow play on the screen, These are mere shadows flickering across the stone wall, and that's what in this allegory of the cave constitutes the reality of everyday perception, and as distinct from the realm of ideas above and behind. In a conference like this, we may be tempted to ask whether this underground theater has an architect, like who designed Plato's cave. Instead, I suggest we ask with these early computer scientists, which comes first, which in a sense is causally prior, the hardware of the cave, or what Plato calls the forms, the ideas that his philosophers gradually discern as they turn around, they escape their chains, leave their chains behind and exit their bondage. Only gradually able, they're sort of blinded by the light of the ideas, gradually able to see the bright glare of the ideas themselves. To what extent, in other words, do embodied technologically mediated social relations, like, people chained to watch screens, people sitting in a kind of movie theater, shape, to what sense do these kind of scenes shape our ideas, including the idea which slowly in the allegory slowly dawns on the philosophers as they exit the cave, the idea that there are ideas in the first place, and the symbols that logicians later devised to describe these ideas, and the natural languages that we use to express them. Recall also that Plato wanted these philosopher kings eventually to return to the basic ideas, that they were kind of going to leave their chains, come into more immediate contact with the realm of ideas, but then return to the cave and govern, the cave being society, and govern. But in what sense, we must reply, are their ideas already a function of the cave and its technical instruments, its apparatus, its machines, if only, as it were, kind of in the last instance? So these are the kind of questions that we typically ask of the relationship between material things and ideas. With such age-old metaphysical questions in mind, we can now add another allegory by translating the Socratic dialogue, which Neoplatonism actually called a dialectic, into modern terms. And by this, I have in mind Hegel's infamous dialectic of lordship and bondage, or master and slave, which again involves chains, and again underlies a concern implicit in this conference, that the concern being that the tables will turn and our machinic servants, that is, our servers, will soon enslave us. That's the sort of paranoid fantasy of AI. In Hegel, in place of the fetters or the chains binding Plato's philosophers into the cave from which they escaped, there's now a chain that binds two figures of unequal social status. This is the master-slave dialectic. One master, the other servant, or perhaps a slave, in an existential struggle of mutual recognition. For the servant, the aim is self-respect, if not outright freedom and equality, to gain what Hegel calls recognition. For the master, the aim is theft, not of material goods like labor, that comes later when Marx turned Hegel upside down, but theft of self-consciousness, or to use the Hegelian language, this is the technical language, being in and for itself for another, which secures the master's sovereignty. All of which is enabled by the chain that binds lord to servant, master to slave, which stands here for another media complex through which both recognition and ideation pass. Or again, is it the other way around? Is Hegel's chain or bond nothing but an abstraction, a kind of weightless metaphor through which we arrive at the idea of a fully conscious idea or spirit, that's the master, the self-realization of the enlightened master, now an intelligent machine, toward which history's uneven dialectic haltingly but inexorably proceeds. In other words, there's a kind of latent Hegelianism, and we can speak in more everyday terms, if you like, in the Q&A about this, but latent in a lot of the narratives that are developing around AI, the kind of teleology, a tendency towards mastery, not by humans, as in Hegel, but of other humans, but of machines. Mm-hmm. Now, given that the feudal nature of this bond, of this bond of lordship and servitude, let alone the afterlife of actual feudalism in Hegel's world. This is, around 1800. We can assume the chain to be forged of iron. What are these kinds of chains made? Made by rough male hands rather than, for example, made in a factory. That next step would be taken by Marx, who remains the elephant in the materialist room, the elephant in the room that we're looking at on the screen, who, after all, made this computer. In the meantime, Hegel's artisanal chain could well have been designed by his Prussian compatriot, the architect Carl Friedrich Schinkel, the designer of the Iron Cross. So materials are involved here, both symbolically and pragmatically. Still, an iron chain is a rather rigid, brittle figure with which to capture the chemical volatility of the Hegelian dialectic. Better, if slightly anachronistic, would be something like an elastic band made with rubber, drawn brutally from the Belgian Congo under whip and chain. Its two ends, again master and slave, stretched in unbearable tension to a near breaking point, only to snap back toward one another, temporarily trading places until order is restored. Or, if that's too much, we can replace the chain with a steel spring, perhaps designed by Schinkel's descendant, Peter Behrens, machine made by unionized workers. Both emphasize the dialectic's asymmetrical dynamism, its strong sense of relentless contradiction, the negation of the negation, and so on. For which, just one more substitution, in place of mechanistic chains, elastic bands, or steel springs, consider a dialectical figure with a different modulus of elasticity altogether, a loop of near instantaneous electronic feedback, the designer of which would indeed be a cybernetician like Norbert Wiener. It's vacuum tubes of the kind that you see. You can't really see them, but they're there. That you can see them, in fact, here in the photograph in this machine. Vacuum tubes that would eventually be replaced with silicon chips, eventually made, perhaps, by women working in a factory in Shenzhen. Mm-hmm. So this is by no means to suggest a deterministic material basis for what the philosopher W.V.O. Quine dismissively called the idea that there are ideas. Its history now denominated in technological epochs from iron to steel to silicon. After all, crude iron chains still do the job in so many ways, nor am I suggesting strict equivalence. Plato's cave as a kind of feedback loop of mastery and servitude, or a struggle between supposedly enlightened philosopher kings strolling the earth and supposedly benighted miners toiling below. Still, if we are to discuss the interplay of materialism and idealism, as I am essentially proposing here, we must eventually ask, who builds and maintains the machines from which machine intelligence is built? Now, I'm not going to actually pursue that question, but I'm just going to let it stand there as, in a sense, running in the background of what I would like to discuss, because I'm going to now return to Turing's paper and to the imitation game. So allowing this question to stand for now, we can now add Turing's imitation game to our allegorical series. In other words, to read this paper as another kind of philosophical allegory. Here's the setup. So I'm just going to describe the game. A teleprinter, so there's a teleprinter, and first to begin with, 3 humans, in a sense, 3 all too human humans. One is a man, A, this gender is specified, a man who's called A, woman who's called B, an interrogator of unspecified gender, that's the third person. It could be a man or a woman. Mm-hmm. Through the teleprinter, the interrogator poses questions to the man, A, and to the woman, B, whom he only knows in this symbolic language as X and Y. Questions that are designed to distinguish between the two. The point is to figure out who is who, man and woman. Questions like these are the kind of things that, this is actually a question from Turing's paper. Quote, will X please tell me the length of his or her hair? So remember, this is 1950 and it's in the UK. So concealed in a separate room, A and B reply by teleprinter. And the point is, the object of A, the man, is his role is to deceive the interrogator into believing that he's a woman, while B, the woman, tries to help the interrogator discover what Turing's game assumes to be the fundamental truth of gender. The interrogator continues posing the questions, and A and B continue responding until the interrogator feels confident that he or she is able to tell which of X and Y is the man, A, and which is the woman, B. So yet we see already here, this is a rather complex setup when you think it through. We see already here at this presumably foundational moment of inquiry into machine intelligence, the control variable is actually gender. Or we should really say gender performativity, because in particular, the man is his whole task is to perform gender. Now, this is not an external variable to be reprocessed later by smart machines. It's a foundational there. Rather, in the imitation game, gender provides the logical basis on which machine intelligence is to be determined in the first place. It's the foundational binary that the interrogator has to choose between. That's because only when this control case is established does the digital computer take the man's place, A. So that's what happens. Basically, A, the man, is replaced by a digital computer. And this computer now has to deceive the interrogator. Remember that in the imitation game, the role of A, previously the man and now the machine, is to deceive the interrogator into believing that he or it is the woman, B. Should the interrogator mistake the machine's answers for those of a female respondent, the machine can be said to pass the Turing test. In other words, should the machine perform human gender adequately with using symbols, the symbols going through the teleprinter, then they pass the test. But rather than ask whether the machine's performance is thereby a sign of intelligence or of thought, that's the usual question posed here. That's essentially what Turing is asking. And by extension, whether this machine may thereby be said to possess a mind, to possess something like intelligence, I ask two other questions. First, what kind of human interrogator? I'm asking about the interrogator, the one who's trying to decide the difference between the two. What kind of human interrogator mistakes signals coming from a machine for those coming from another human? And second, how is it that the category of the human, threatened not by thinking machines, but by the more profound possibility that machines can successfully imitate thought, how has the human been divided here into the naturalized binary of man and woman, to mark the point when the gender performances of humans become indistinguishable from those of machines? Because that's actually what's going on in what we can now call an intelligence complex. Within the imitation game itself, the architecture of this complex is restricted to a simple pair of rooms connected electronically by a teleprinter. So this is the basic infrastructure, the kind of architecture in that sense of this whole setup. A simple pair of rooms connected electronically by a teleprinter with an interface of printed characters, that is, symbols, on either side. Set side by side with the other allegorical scenes that we've been considering, that I've just kind of laid out, from the shadows playing across the surface of Plato's cave, to the chain that binds master and slave in a life and death struggle in Hegel's dialectic, the test itself appears as an allegory in which the subjectivity, indeed the very humanity, of the interrogator is taken to an outer limit, along with and through binaries like gender on which that subjectivity is based. In other words, at issue seems to be less the subjectivity of the machine as a being able to imitate human intelligence than the subjectivity of the human interrogator, who can no longer tell the difference. Reversing the question, we can also ask to what extent the subjectivity of the interrogator is hardware dependent. That's the question I was beginning with. For instance, what are not the players all potential members of a kind of professional managerial economic class by virtue of their access to this hardware to begin with? In other words, who can enter this room? It's only a very specific set of human beings that we call today the professional managerial class. Or perhaps quite the opposite, these players of the game are experimental subjects of technocratic biopower, the kind of laboratory rats of the intelligence complex. Here again, the complex itself is like the chain that binds master to slave in Hegel's dialectic, made material, in this case, by Marx. For either way does not class position, understood as a social relation to the means of production, in other words, access to the room, in some sense also shape this game of machine intelligence, which, as we've already noted, is overdetermined by gender, and probably, I haven't discussed this, but probably also by race. Who has access to these rooms in the first place? Who is able to play such games, and in doing so, to put their own subjectivity on the line? Such questions are akin to those asked today, not only about who makes the chips on which our intelligent machines run, but who trains the machines to recognize patterns. In other words, who feeds them the data in a relentlessly dehumanizing, rote manner, such that they may all the more successfully imitate thought, thereby, again, precipitating a crisis of subjectivity for their users at the other end in conferences like this. But before returning to the fable of Zeuxis and Parrhasius, in order eventually to reconnect all of this to architecture, I just have one more allegory to add to the series, which brings the story closer to our own time, just another variation in a sense on Turing's game. In 1980, unconvinced by the claims of what he called strong AI to possess awareness and understanding comparable to the human mind, the American philosopher John R. Searle, who I should acknowledge is a problematic figure to cite here for various other reasons, I can explain later, but Searle proposed a modification to Turing's test, which has become known as the Chinese room argument. First, we need a computer that has passed the Turing test. So we need a computer that has already passed the Turing test, though this time not by successfully performing human gender, but by persuading a Chinese-speaking interrogator that it too is a Chinese speaker. And of course, this is one of many reasons that this is a complicated example, but this presupposes that it naturalizes the English language as the basis in which these tests are going to be conducted. Searle then replaces, so basically they have to, the computer would have had to persuade a Chinese-speaking interrogator that it can speak Chinese. Searle then replaces this computer with himself, isolated in a room with vast quantities of paper, filing cabinets, pencils, and erasers. On some portion of the paper is this computer's program for processing Chinese characters. Though Searle cannot read Chinese himself, he can read the program, which is written in English. Through a slot in the door, the interrogator slips questions posed in the Chinese language. Without comprehending the content of these questions, because he can't read Chinese, Searle nevertheless manually executes the computer's program using the paper, pencils, and filing cabinets that are in the room at his disposal, and returns Chinese language output through the door. He kind of replies in written Chinese characters, even though he can't read or write Chinese. In this way, he effectively converses with the interrogator in Chinese without understanding the language that he's using. Searle's argument challenges the assumption that intelligence is hardware independent by taking this argument at face value. Since it was the software, not the hardware, that passed the initial Turing test by this argument, there would be no difference in the output generated by the electronic computer or by the philosopher using paper and pencil. The hardware doesn't matter. Given the identical results, he argues, since Searle himself does not understand a word of Chinese, there is no basis on which to say that the computer understands the language despite its and his fluent, in other words, the same reasons there's no basis in which to claim that the computer actually understands the language despite its and his fluent conversational manipulation of that language's written symbols. So as you know, this debate continues. The proponents of strong AI, for example, have replied to Searle's challenge by suggesting that the difference in processing speed by which a computer and a human being may execute the same program, the computer in nearly an instant, the human in uncounted years, is what makes a difference in understanding intelligence as an emergent property. But even here, that difference is registered in material terms, closer to the earlier computer brain analogy, rather than the abstract processing of symbols that defines the computer mind. Ultimately, then, we're returned to the fable of Zeuxis and Parrhasius, in which imitation becomes real. Not in the sense that the grapes painted by Zeuxis to fool the birds are real grapes, or the curtain painted by his competitor to fool Zeuxis is a real curtain, but in the sense that the birds and Zeuxis really are deceived. That if that's the right word, they really are deceived, if that's the right word, into believing that these painted objects are real things. The birds really, come and peck at the paint. Likewise for the human interrogators in Turing's imitation game and in Searle's Chinese room argument. In all cases, the crisis precipitated by the technological complex in which machines exchange symbols with humans, because that's what's going on, machines exchanging symbols with humans, is first of all a crisis of human subjectivity and only secondarily a crisis of machine intelligence. Once again, I therefore ask, what kind of human cannot tell the difference between symbols generated by a human and those symbols generated by a machine and those generated by another human? Notice again, finally, that I'm speaking of, I've said symbols, since in all cases, this is how the game is played, not with material bodies or material brains per se, or with electronic circuitry in its place. That's all there as the infrastructure for the game, but with representations that are very much like the shadows in Plato's cave. Shadows of grapes for Zeuxis, the shadow of a curtain for Parrhasius, the shadow of gender for Turing, the shadows of shadows, or shadows moving from one language to another, for Searle. In all cases, the underlying premise is of the human as a processor of symbols, and of the machine as a kind of artist, a competitor who can outwit Parrhasius by generating symbols, whether visual or verbal, that even the great painter, a master of deceit, were he placed in the position of the interrogator of Turing's game, might mistake for the real thing, like real symbols. Not in the sense of what they represent, grapes or curtains or buildings, let's say, but in how they represent. Symbols, that is, that seem to be produced by a human artist rather than by a machine. Which brings us finally back to architecture and to my sort of concluding example. In one sense, I've been speaking all along here of architecture, or at least of proto-architectural things in this series of allegories that I've sketched, from caves to chains to anonymous rooms inhabited by humans or by machines. So a kind of architecture in that sense. But to be satisfied with this infrastructural understanding of architecture is to miss its own capacity to convey, or at least to support, symbolic meaning. So this is what's on the table here, is the question of meaning, ultimately. Since the days of Adolf Loos, this capacity in architecture has been said to exist primordially in two complementary forms, monuments and tombs. I therefore conclude these reflections with a modest proposal, that the difficult questions posed by the conference organizers regarding the implications of AI for human subjectivity and human social relations be translated into an architectural imitation game similar to that devised by Turing, with the difference being that both subjects behind the wall, a machine and a human, be asked to design a meaningful symbol. So that's asked to design a meaningful symbol. To do so, we to kind of change the scene a little bit, we must first convert the interrogator's room, in which somebody is posing these questions, into a gallery of sorts, in which we're going to view the results. Adjacent to this room are two, we can call them studios. In one studio is a machine, or at least there's an interface, a machinic interface. In the other studio is no longer an individual human, but an entire atelier, or we could say an office, made up of any number of talented, trained professionals with all the software that they need. Pritzker Prize winners, even, with unpaid interns chained to them like slave to master, forming a collective designated by a symbolic name in the way that we designate our architects, a name, say, like Gary, or a symbolic acronym like OMA, or if that's anachronistic, that's like a little old-fashioned, some more modest local name in tune with the times. Then ask each of these Pritzker winners, or both of these, the Pritzker winners and the machine, to design a memorial, including to choose the subject of the memorial and its site, the kind of typical studio problem. The memorial itself, as a program, as a type, being a paradigmatic case of symbolic meaning making that, at least in principle, probes humanity's depths, while remaining, nevertheless, as I think we well know in the memory industry in which architecture participates, while remaining perpetually poised at the edge of cliché. Replace the interrogator now on the other side of the wall, essentially, with a jury of experts, as we do in our field, tasked with judging the results. Their aim being to decide which memorial was designed by Pritzker Prize winners and which was designed by the machine. The machine's challenge is not necessarily to imitate the style of, you remember, the machine's challenge is to deceive the jury, right? But that is not necessary to imitate the style of Gary, OMA, or whomever, that is to design in the manner of, but to balance originality with cliché, and virtuosity with guile, such that the results will fool the jury. The converse is true for the human architects. If what they design is too virtuosic, too perfect in a way, their design might seem machine-like. But if it's too stereotypically sensitive, in other words, if it's, for example, rendered in watercolor or something, it might approach formulaic cliché. As in other cases, what is ultimately being tested is not the creativity of the machine, but the humanity of the jury. Not in some absolute sense, but in the situated historical sense in which it is now entirely possible to mistake a memorial designed by AI for one designed by a group of humans. This would be, in some sense, the ultimate obscenity. And yet, this is the condition, the situation that ultimately I think we're faced with, this possibility. The point being, or I guess I could put this another way, a little more softly. Would this be an obscenity? The point being, once again, not the relative intelligence of machines, demonstrated here by a capacity to produce a meaningful architectural symbol, but the capacity of certain elements within the intelligence complex to imitate the production of meaningful architectural symbols in a manner that precipitates a crisis in those who can't tell the difference. In that sense, and most visibly when extended to the arts, and including architecture, artificial intelligence is not a property of machines, but a property of a technological complex of the sort that I've been describing here, more specifically a media complex that binds humans to machines, machines to other machines, and humans to other humans, in asymmetrical relations that ought to be the real object of our concern. Within this complex, intelligence is defined as the capacity to imitate symbolic expression. Remaking and retaking the Turing test with this criterion in mind reveals a society for which symbolic meaning has become a question to which the AI-based intelligence complex provides an answer. If persuasive, that answer in turn, in other words, memorials designed by machines. If persuasive, that answer in turn provokes a crisis of subjectivity among those to whom it is addressed. All of this according to the rules of an imitation game that we continue to play, whether we know it or not, and whether we like it or not. Thank you. Okay, now I'm going to unshare. And
thank you very much. It has been a really thought-provoking lecture. Thank you very much for your time. I'm really taken by many of the things you have said, and I am the author of those questions that you were referring to. So here,
the dialogue
in conversation. So I would like to pose a first comment or a question to you. I'm so happy you went through the history of AI, which no one until now in this conference delved into as you have. As I was looking at your photograph and also thinking about what you were saying, the comment of it looked like a Plato cave, this computer room, and how it relates to gender. I was thinking that in reality, from what I have learned, already in the 1940s and 50s, these computer machines involved a lot of women to produce them. Not only to produce them, but also to manage them. Women were all over. And there was even this term that it was coined, that it was the kilo girl. And kilo girl was a unit to measure the computer power, because it equaled this kilo girl. It would be like now we would say the processor, imagine the gigabytes. So kilo girl was it meant that this computer had this equal to this so many hours of girls working in computing and doing the same task as that. So women were initially, I think, very involved in this field in computer science. And then from what I have learned, I hope I'm not wrong, but it was more like in the 80s when they start getting kicked out through these really big mega companies developing computers led by very important men that are, some of them still alive, that were featured in the covers of magazines. We all know who they are. So in a way, in the 80s meant a decade of kicking out women out of this production of knowledge. And I think now we are still probably in that situation that it's much more beneficial for men. Our men are in a stronger position now. So when you look at the image you brought, I was thinking like, how can we have how did we manage to do so bad now if we started well in the beginning? You know, when you're talking about how these things were produced initially, maybe I'm being too idealistic now, but there was much more inclusiveness in the way the knowledge was being produced. But now, instead of going in a way forward, we seem to have changed the roles. So that was first thought that I had on that.
So, yes, in fact, the first computers, and the word computer is gendered in the sense that the media theorist Catherine Hales has written about this. There's a book called, I'm tempted to take it off the shelf here. It's here. My Mother Was a Computer is the title of her book, I think. And a computer was somebody who computed, who did calculations manually in the way that you just described, and these were mostly women, and from that practice was derived the term computer, as was sort of translated, you could say, onto the machine, and so because what I'm doing in all of this is in a sense looking at the problem from both sides, the materialist, the side of, in this theme along these lines we would discuss in terms of whose labor is inscribed into the machine, whose bodies are necessary, and in what way to produce this problem in the first place. That's the gender question as you've described it. But at the same time, the problem of gender here as an idea, as a concept, which I'm alluding to the work of Judith Butler, obviously, when I'm talking about gender performativity. But Butler, actually, who began her philosophical explorations with Hegel and this dialectic of master and the lordship and bondage. But that this is one way to put this, is that what we're dealing with historically, in both a material sense of the actual social relations, behind these rooms that we're looking at, these big machines that become little machines, and they now have satellites and all kinds. Behind all of that, or within all of that, are real social relations, are real humans in an asymmetrical struggle, a conflict. And Marx calls this class conflict, and of course that conflict has many dimensions that involve race and gender and geography and all various other forms of domination. So of the sort that you just described, including the ones that you just described. to that, or within that, I nevertheless want to add this problem of the idea that circulating with all and in the symbols that are moving back and forth between the machines and on the screens and wherever else, in this realm of representations, there is the idea that there are ideas here. There are concepts like the concept of gender that are being negotiated, worked out, and tested. And it's that's what's being tested here, the idea that there's an idea, and can you imitate an idea, or at least convey through symbolic language, convey the sense that you, the machine, or you, the human, are capable of having an idea. So that too, that whole construct can be analyzed in and through the social relations of gender and other forms of differentiation. But I still want to, in a sense, return to and find a language to address the problem of representation and of the ideas that move through here. That's the reason for all these allegories. That these are essentially allegories of ideation, if that makes sense.
Thank you very much. And I would also like to share another comment I have. I'm so happy you brought up the papers by Simon and Newell and Turing. They were, as you mentioned, researching the relationship between computation and how can we relate it to the human brain and the mind, and how can it be compared, and if they will be so close as our human minds. As I have learned, artificial intelligence since its beginning, it was very related to the development of neuroscience and how the researchers trying to find out how the brain works to try to make computers that work similarly to develop in the same way and get something very powerful. Now we are in the opposite situation that these very realistic images, they are so real, we don't know if a person has done them, or sometimes we have strived so much in architecture to do super hyper realistic images, and now this is the ultimate, and we just get it in a few seconds. And so now I thought it was really thought-provoking, your question to think, so how can we as architects differentiate ourselves from all of these very high quality renders and productions that are being it's now available with just a small with a click. No, it's just in a few seconds you get this wonderful render that it's just like a photograph, and it's totally into the point. So I would also like to mention that, and this is only my thought, that relating to the Pritzker Prize, I am very happy to the prizes that have been awarded, but also I would also like to call if some more women could be included in the future, because I am sure that there are many valuable women doing work, and not to diminish their work.
Well, I'll just try to make it a little more concrete that sort of that allegory. I of course agree with you about the ongoing biases in our field, but I'm speaking to you from New York, and kind of a little bit what I have in mind is that if something like the profound, really, sort of soul-shattering contradictions and problems posed by the events around 9/11 here that resulted in this kind of very monumental memorial were to have been addressed in this kind of AI environment that we're talking about, the realism you have renderings, which might be one of the factors. That's the more traditional way of considering the problem is, that hyper realistic images would be used to persuade an audience or something that this should be built. But what I'm have in mind is that what we actually basically did have this set up, bunch of Pritzker Prize types, or future Pritzker Prize, whatever. And it's true, there's a lot of boys and a lot of egos and so on. But what we got was a cliche. And so the question is essentially, can machines do better? And I'm not really worried about whether it's designed by a machine or a human. As teachers, we all have this problem, right? If you assign an assignment to the students in the room or on the screen, if you write your paper with ChatGPT, at this point, this isn't the problem. It's the question is whether you're learning anything. And the same thing, but this is why I call it a complex. It's a set of relations through which meaning is produced. It really wouldn't matter to me whether the 9/11 problem were addressed by AI or by Daniel Libeskind. I think probably AI would do better in my judgment. And better, we would of course have to debate and dispute probably what that would mean. But in doing so, the problem would not be about what the object is. It's not about the design. It's about our self-understanding. Because the memorial is a very specific type that is as much about the survivors as it is about the commemorative, the lives lost, for example. And survivors coming to terms with a tragic event, a historical crisis. And so it's we who are asking these questions. This is in a way, the theme I keep returning to. This problem is not about the machines, it's about us. Or our relation to these machines and that we've made, and that in return make us, but in very particular ways that we probably are not as aware of as we should be. And so we don't necessarily want to make some absolute distinction between a rendering made by a computer and a rendering made by an architect. I mean, one of the biggest cliches these days coming out of the machines is watercolors. So there's not just the realistic renderings. So these are all the reasons that I think that it's like holding up a mirror. This problem, it like holds up a mirror. In this case, I don't know. I don't know how you want to define the boundaries of the audience for this conference, or but broadly speaking, the creative intelligence that is tasked to build and design and conceive the built environment. So that's who's in the mirror, and that's what we're really looking at when we're asking these questions. If that makes sense. That makes sense? I don't know. Okay.
Yes, thank you very much, Reinhold. So unfortunately, we are now short in time, but so we should stop this amazing conversation. But I really appreciate your input, and I would like to thank you very much. I would also like to thank our sponsors for our conference, including KTH School of Architecture, and in special to the head of the department, Katia Grillner, who is here also listening to you today. I don't know if you can see her. Maybe.
Oh, okay.
Just one second. Can you get the? Hi. Hello, it's
Hi.
Thank you so much.
This is Katia Grillner. And also KTH Digitalisation Platform, Digital Futures, and the European Commission, the Marie Skłodowska-Curie Actions. So thank you very much, everyone, and those of you on YouTube listening here. Also the people in the room, including Professor Anders Bergström, also here at the KTH School of Architecture. So it's been a true pleasure. Thank you very much, Reinhold, for your lecture. I wish we can continue these conversations in some other time. And all the best. Please join us again at 2:30 sharp. We are starting with our next speaker of the conference. So see you soon. Thank you, Reinhold. Thank you very much.
Okay, take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Enjoy.
Thank you. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thanks.